Las Vegas never sleeps. Even when the stage lights go out, the city keeps living, in the shadows of casinos, behind closed bar doors, in the haze of cigars and the clinking of ice in glasses. Dean Martin loved this time. When you didn't have to smile at the audience. When you could speak honestly. He knew Hollywood not from scripts or press releases. He had seen how fame is made, and what is paid for it. He often said that the film industry is not a world of dreams, but a system. And every system has rules that are never written in contracts. For decades, Hollywood sold the world a beautiful legend. But behind it were compromises, fear, and loneliness. Today, 5 stories. 5 women's lives that became symbols of an era. And one perspective from a man who saw it all from the inside. The most expensive item on the banquet table of the old wolves. If anyone had the right to sit in a dimly lit Las Vegas bar, take a slow drag from a cigarette, and speak out loud what Hollywood preferred to keep silent about, it was Dean Martin. He was no moralist. He didn't pretend to be a saint. He had simply been inside the system too long to keep pretending. He saw Hollywood as it really was, not as it appeared on the screen. Not a world of dreams and spotlights, but a cold market where people sold not only their talent, but themselves, sometimes willingly, sometimes out of desperation. In the last years of his life, when the applause had grown quieter and the clinking of glasses sounded louder, Dean Martin once spoke a name that made the room fall silent. A name that millions spoke with admiration. For him, however, it was not admiration that stirred, but a heavy, weary sorrow. Marilyn Monroe. To understand who she really was, one must erase the iconic image from memory, the blonde over the subway grate, laughter, ease, sexuality. All of that was packaging. The real story begins much earlier, in the late 1940s, before Marilyn even existed. She was Norma Jean Baker. A slight, insecure, often hungry girl, without family, protection, or a backup plan. There were hundreds like her in Hollywood at the time. But only a few survived. And Dean Martin knew why. He knew the rules of the game. They were not written in contracts. They were whispered. Studio moguls ruled like feudal lords. Their word could make or break a career in a single evening. For girls without money or connections, the path upward was not a ladder but a narrow corridor with no doors, except one. The bedroom door. Marilyn entered this system too early and too defenseless. Before becoming an icon of an era, she went through a series of situations that official film history prefers not to recall. Dean Martin heard about them from those who never lied behind closed doors, from Frank Sinatra, from people whose names were never in the credits. Private parties. Secluded mansions. Alcohol, laughter, power. And a young girl who understood, if she refused today, tomorrow she would simply be forgotten. In 1949, Marilyn agreed to a photo shoot that would later become legendary. $50. Not fame. Not art. Just money to pay rent and buy food. Dean Martin always emphasized this point. There was no calculation, no strategy. There was survival. But the photo shoot was only the beginning. At private gatherings, Marilyn did not appear as an equal. She was part of the evening's script. Her smile, mandatory. Her consent, expected. Dean remembered her eyes. He said it was the eyes that told the truth. The smile worked perfectly. But the eyes were empty, as if the person had already accepted what was about to happen. There was a term, casting couch. But in her case, it was an entire system. Late-night phone calls. Come by, we'll read the script. Hotel rooms. Men who didn't even pretend it was about movies. Later, Dean Martin said a phrase that best described her fate. Marilyn's innocence on screen was her most difficult role. Because in real life, she learned too early how the world worked. She knew that beauty was the only capital she had, and she knew that this capital burned the fastest. In Las Vegas, whispered conversations circulated, stories that would never make it into the press. That Marilyn sometimes attended private gatherings of people whose names were spoken only in whispers. There, she was not an actress. She was a symbol, an ornament, a sign of status. Dean saw how she accepted it without struggle. Not because she wanted to, but because she understood. Refusal meant the end. Poverty. Oblivion. What tormented him most was not what she did, but how she was treated. Hollywood created her image, then exploited it to exhaustion. They made her a symbol of sexuality, even though they themselves had placed her in a situation with no other choice. To Dean Martin, Marilyn was never a bad girl. She was a victim of a system that feeds on desire and crushes those who believe in it. When he raised a glass to her memory, he did not see the glossy covers. He saw Norma Jean. A girl leaving someone else's bedroom at dawn, hands trembling, hoping that today had not been in vain. Marilyn Monroe stands at the beginning of this list not as an accusation, but as a warning. In Hollywood, everything has a price. And sometimes that price is not a career, but yourself. Dean Martin knew these places firsthand. He saw talented girls break under pressure and how few managed to rise to the top while keeping even a part of their soul intact. Lucille was one of those, a rare example of someone who could turn pain into strength, transforming weaknesses into weapons. Life, however, constantly presented her with difficult choices. When she agreed to appear in the film Velvet, then called a stag film, a short, private movie made for an adult audience. It was her way to survive and pay for her education, food, and housing. To modern eyes, this may seem like a harsh compromise, but in that time, it was a brutal reality, where sacrifices and concessions were the norm. Later, when Lucille became Joan Crawford and rose to the top of Hollywood, her past became a threat to her image. In the 1930s, any leak of that dark film could instantly destroy her career. MGM could not allow a scandal and hired Eddie Mannix, a man who handled problems of any level, from threats to the removal of compromising material. A huge amount of money was spent to erase all traces, transforming the girl from a simple dancer into a perfectly respectable movie star. For Dean Martin, this always seemed like a double challenge. On one side, triumph, on the other, the price paid for it. Joan created an image of strictness, purity, almost asceticism, but beneath it lay a story of struggle, pain, and constant self-control to keep the past hidden. She became a master of survival. Every step was calculated, every smile a weapon, every role a strategy. She knew the rules of the game and played better than anyone. But this mastery required inner sacrifice. Joan never allowed herself to trust, could not relax, constantly fearing that someone might uncover her dark past. It was for this sacrifice that Dean Martin included her in his list. Not for immorality, but for how she turned trials into a tool for victory. She became the queen of Hollywood, but this queen knew the cost of every triumph, the price of loneliness, eternal vigilance, and inner coldness. When Joan Crawford walked the red carpet, shining in an evening gown, Dean saw not glamour but a survival strategy. Every gesture, every movement was part of a game she played her entire life. And although the outside world saw only success, for Dean it was a story of struggle, discipline, and incomprehensible strength bought with her own sacrifices. Joan Crawford was not bad or a bad example. She is proof that Hollywood knows how to turn those willing to pay any price into legends. Overcoming darkness for the Hollywood crown. If Marilyn was a lost lamb among hungry wolves, Joan Crawford was a true she-wolf. She entered the tiger's den with open eyes, fully aware of every decision and every price she would have to pay for success. Like many future stars, Joan started from the very bottom. Her real name was Lucille Lesueur, a simple girl, without wealth or connections, armed only with the determination to survive. She danced in nightclubs in Chicago and Detroit, where dancing was just the outward shell for far harsher rules. A smile, attention, or favor could be paid for with more than just money. These clubs were mini Hollywoods in themselves. They tested resilience, observed reactions, and judged who was ready to go all the way for their dream. Dean Martin knew these places firsthand. He saw talented girls break under pressure, and he saw how few managed to reach the top while keeping even a fragment of their soul. Lucille was one of the few, but life constantly placed her before difficult choices. When she agreed to participate in the film Velvet, then called a stag film, a short, private production made for adult audiences, it was her way to survive and pay for schooling, food, and lodging. This was the reality of the time. Harsh and uncompromising. Later, when Lucille became Joan Crawford and rose to the top of Hollywood, her past became a threat to her image. In the 1930s, any leak of that dark film could instantly destroy her career. MGM could not afford scandal and hired Eddie Mannix, a man who handled problems, at any level, from threats to erasing compromising material. A huge sum of money was spent to hide the film forever, erase every trace, transforming the girl from a simple dancer into an image of impeccable respectability. For Dean Martin, this always seemed like a double test. On one hand, triumph, on the other, the price paid for that triumph. Joan crafted an image of discipline, purity, almost asceticism, but beneath it lay a story of struggle, pain, and constant self-control to ensure her past never resurfaced. She became a master of survival. Every step calculated, every smile a weapon, every role a strategy. She knew the rules of the game and played them better than anyone. But this mastery required an internal sacrifice. Joan could never fully trust, never relax, always fearing that someone might unearth her dark past. It was precisely this sacrifice that made Dean Martin include her in his list. Not for immorality, but for how she turned trials into tools of victory. She became the queen of Hollywood, but this queen knew the price of every victory: loneliness, eternal vigilance, and inner coldness. When Joan Crawford walked the red carpet, dazzling in her evening gown, Dean did not see glamour. He saw survival strategy. Every gesture, every movement was part of a lifelong game she had been playing. And though the outside world saw only success, to Dean it was a story of struggle, discipline, and incomprehensible strength bought through personal sacrifice. Joan Crawford was not a bad figure or a cautionary tale. She was proof that Hollywood could transform those willing to pay any price into legends. Dessert at parties and the price of attention. If Marilyn Monroe was an innocent victim of the system, and Lana Turner a seasoned player in a world of dangerous men, Jane Mansfield became an example of the tragedy that occurs when talent and intellect are used merely as instruments of beauty, and personality is turned into a commodity for elite entertainment. Jane possessed extraordinary charisma and intelligence. Her IQ was estimated at 163, she spoke 5 languages, played the violin, and was a devoted mother. But these qualities did not earn her what Hollywood demanded. Men, the authorities, and the public wanted not a clever woman, but a striking, captivating image, a woman ready to shine in public while simultaneously serving as a tool for the amusement of the rich and influential. In Las Vegas and Washington, Jane attended parties where her presence was never accidental. She was an ornament for the most powerful men, politicians, business leaders, and media figures. Her mission was crystal clear: to appear dazzling, attractive, and impressive, creating an atmosphere of celebration. It was a form of unspoken exchange. Her beauty, charm, and appearance became a currency that earned recognition, resources, and attention. But Jane understood the price of this game. Every laugh, every smile, every flirtatious gesture cost her private life, self-respect, and peace of mind. She knew that behind the glamour lay immense effort, control over every movement, every reaction, and constant readiness to be the right version for the audience and those who held power. At these parties, events unfolded that were nearly invisible to the public, but Dean Martin and his close circle knew the truth. Jane could turn every gesture into a tool to maintain influence, yet at the same time, she remained a captive of a system in which she was simultaneously admired and possessed. The profound tragedy of her life was that, despite her intellect, talent, and vast potential, Jane was forced to play a role dictated by Hollywood. She became a symbol of how beauty and public success could be used as currency in a world that barely valued a woman's personality or inner life. When her popularity began to fade, the world showed no mercy. Jane was cast aside, forced to work in less prestigious settings, and even her remarkable intellect could not restore her former status. Her tragic death in 1967 became a sorrowful full stop in the story of a woman who tried to balance personal dreams, intellect, and the demands of a system ready to exploit beauty for its own gain. For Dean Martin, Jane Mansfield was not merely a symbol of beauty, but a victim of circumstance, struggling to survive in a world where intellectual abilities often went unnoticed. Her story is a warning: beauty and talent can be powerful tools, but they can never replace true freedom and protection. A thorny rose growing from the mud. Barbara Stanwyck was a woman of a completely different category. If the previous heroines were victims of circumstance or forced to play their roles in the world of Hollywood and crime, Barbara was a true fighter. She was born Ruby Stevens, an orphan raised in the poor alleys of Brooklyn, where life demanded cunning, strength, and survival skills from an early age. In the 1920s, Ruby began her path not on the screen, but on stage. As a dancer in the Ziegfeld Follies and in the infamous speakeasy clubs. These establishments were nests of criminal power. Gangsters, corrupt officials, and nighttime magnates gathered there. Young girls like Ruby were used not only for entertainment, but also as instruments in the game of power, in the hands of influential men. Dean Martin watched Ruby learn to survive in this world. She understood that beauty and charm could be weapons, but only if you knew how to control the situation and refused to let others manipulate you. She transformed her talent and seductive skills into a tool that allowed her to climb Hollywood's ladder, step by step. Barbara was never a victim, she was a strategist. Every action on stage and off was calculated, every decision a deliberate part of a plan. She used the lessons of her past to protect herself and her career, turning childhood humiliations and hardships into strength and the ability to control the men who had once controlled her. On screen, Barbara shone in roles of manipulative, powerful women, as in Double Indemnity or The Big Valley. Dean Martin claimed that the cold, calculating gaze of her characters was not acting. It was Ruby Stevens' own look, forged in years of hardship, showing a woman who had learned to use men before they could use her. Barbara entered Hollywood not as an innocent girl, but as a wolf who had already tasted blood and learned to survive. She took everything life offered, but did so skillfully that the world saw only glamour and talent. The personal cost was high, loneliness, emotional isolation, and constant vigilance became part of her life. Men came for her beauty, then for her fame, but never truly for her soul. For Dean Martin, Barbara Stanwyck became a symbol of strength and survival in a Hollywood world where beauty and talent are weapons, but only for those willing to pay the highest price. She proved that it is possible to rise from the mud and become a legend, but the path to the top leaves indelible scars. Barbara Stanwyck closes this dark list as an example of a woman who was never a victim, she was the architect of her own destiny. Yet her story serves as a reminder that even victory in Hollywood, as in life, comes with pain, sacrifices, and losses that leave deep marks on the soul. When the stage lights dim, when the applause has faded, and the last martini glass sits empty, only the truth remains. Hollywood is not just glitter and smiles on magazine covers. It is a world where beauty, talent, and ambition are turned into currency, and the human soul often becomes a hostage to the system. The 5 women we remember today, Marilyn Monroe, Joan Crawford, Lana Turner, Jane Mansfield, and Barbara Stanwyck, each faced this world in her own way. Their stories differ, but one thing unites them: the need to survive where kindness and fairness were almost non-existent. The world saw their smiles, their dresses, their jewelry, their on-screen personas. But no one saw what lay beneath that veneer, the nights of doubt, the pain, the sacrifices they made for their dreams. They played their roles not only on screen but in life itself, where every gesture could become a ticket to the next scene, the next opportunity, the next role. And here is what is important: they were not merely victims of the system. They were survivors, strategists, masters of a game in which the stakes were unbearably high. Each of them used her talent, intelligence, and beauty to advance in a world where control over one's destiny was hard-won. When we remember them today, it is not nostalgia for easy fame. It is a lesson in the price of success, in how cruel and demanding the world of art can be, the world we are accustomed to seeing only from the outside. And this lesson extends beyond Hollywood. It touches any sphere where power, money, and influence can overshadow human kindness. Yet, amidst all this harshness, there is light. The light of their courage, their strength, and their ability to survive in circumstances where the rules were unfair. They show that even in the harshest conditions, a person can maintain dignity, resilience, and the pursuit of dreams. So when you watch films, read their stories, or hear the names of these legends, remember, behind every glittering cover was a struggle, behind every smile was endurance, and behind every role was a human cost. Hollywood without masks is not only darkness and exploitation. It is also a story of strength, bravery, and the art of survival. And perhaps that is the true beauty of these women, their ability to leave a mark despite all obstacles, teaching us that behind the gloss there is always a story of courage. And when the stage lights finally go out, what remains in memory is not the images of covers and red carpets, but the women who stood their ground. They leave us a lesson: even in a world where everything has a price, it is possible to find the strength to be yourself, to survive, and to leave a mark that no one can erase. Let these stories remind us that a person's true value is not in how others see them, but in how they preserve themselves in the most difficult circumstances.